Hello and good morning. Joe Justice here, coming to you live on December 5th, 2022. We are back into the first full week of December. We are well into the holiday season. I hope you guys are having a good one so far. Are you getting ready for Christmas? Do you have all your decorations up? Did you get them all up over the weekend? Do you have your tree? Do you have your lights? Are your kids excited? I know mine are. We went to a skating party over the weekend, and I haven't roller skated in probably 30 years. So it was the first time in a long time that I've roller skated, but it was a lot of fun. And I was still able to do it. It took me a little while to get my legs under me. It's not, it's different from what I remembered, but I guess it's like riding a bike. You don't ever really forget. It took me about a half hour, but I was able to do it and had a lot of fun with it. So it was a great weekend. What about you guys? Did you guys do anything fun over the weekend? Let me know. Drop me a comment. Let me know how things went. So today, I want to tell you a story about America. And not just America, but this was all over the world. But it seemed to be particularly pernicious in America. First of all, you've got to understand, what was life like for humans before the Industrial Revolution? Before the Industrial Revolution, almost everybody grew up on a farm or lived near a small farm, and life was pretty simple. It was, you didn't travel very far. You only traveled for about 20 miles. You ate what you could catch. Very simple meals, very simple food. You'd probably have mostly, things like beans, potatoes, very simple food. You would, if you slaughtered an animal, it would be part of a big meal, more of a feast. If you wanted something small, it would probably be something more like fowl, like chicken or something like that you would fix, and you'd eat it right away. Before there's any kind of refrigeration, there was just nothing you could do with extra food. So it's extra food isn't something that you had. If you did have it, you'd find some way to cure it. You would salt it, or do other kind of method for smoke it, do other things to preserve it. So food was very simple outside of, nobledom, outside of, if you were very wealthy, you had very simple food. You kind of ate, you were a dirt subsistence farmer. So the Industrial Revolution changed all of that. And people moved from outside of the farm into the cities. Now, the movement from outside of the farm into the cities was a huge deal. It was a massive change for society in ways that we're still grappling with to this day, okay? The biggest problem is there was no access to food. The meat that would be transported would get rancid because it just couldn't transport fast enough. Refrigeration didn't really exist. It started to come into being, but I mean, it wasn't available in any kind of micro or macro scale or anything. You couldn't freeze food. You couldn't keep food for very long. You couldn't cure all that food with salt and smoking and everything. So the food became very rancid. It was often, they added all kinds of awful stuff like sawdust and stuff like that to the food to make it last longer. Or like for like ground beef, they would add a bunch of sawdust and stuff to kind of plump it out to make it look like it was more than it was. I mean, they did awful, awful things back in those days. So it's very difficult to get the food. Anything that was natural, if you had to bake it, like you had to bake it right away. You couldn't store it for very long. And what really became a goal of the food industry at the turn of the century after the Industrial Revolution was this whole idea of shelf stability. To make something shelf stable. That was really, really important. That became kind of the focus of everything. If you could have something that could sit on a shelf for a week, that was a big deal. And that's where we started to get the foods that we have today. The foods that we call processed foods are all a result of that technology. The technology of being shelf stable. So you can go back and look at the advent of the Kraft company to get an example of that. So Kraft, they started out as cheese distributors. So they did wholesale cheese deliveries. they would go from store to store delivering cheese on a horse wagon, right? Now, the problem with cheese was without refrigeration, cheese wouldn't last very long. It would only last for a few days. Back in those days, they would put it in bottles, and you couldn't can cheese because it's not something that you can do with cheese. So they'd put it in bottles so that it would last for a couple days. So basically, you had to get it like right away. And it was the same thing with milk, especially before pasteurization. You know, you had to have it delivered daily. It was a daily kind of thing because you had to get it right away before it went bad. So what the Kraft organization did was Kraft, the actual guy Kraft, he learned about a food scientist that had been adding sodium citrate to cheese. So they melt the cheese, they add sodium citrate, and that stops the aging process. Cheese has kind of a natural aging process, and that's part of the process for certain types of cheese. You let them age for long periods of time, but not most cheeses. But if you add sodium citrate, then it stops the aging process. So he added that in, and then so melt the cheese, add that in, and then cool the cheese, and then it's shelf stable. And that's where we get Kraft cheese. That's where Kraft cheese comes from. And it can be shelf stable for a long time, for weeks. And so all of the foods around this era, all of the foods started focusing on being shelf stable. That's where we get all of the seed oils that are used to create everything from Twinkies and breads and cheeses and all this kind of stuff. You'll notice that if you get a lot of people notice, like if they come from like Europe, for example, one of the strangest things they experience is if you get like a Twinkie or something like that, it doesn't mold within a few days. Like regular bread, if you just like go to a baker and get bread and you just set it on your counter, it'll mold in a couple of days because it doesn't have all those preservatives and chemicals. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about processed foods. There's the problem with processed foods is the idea behind them was to create shelf-stable, high-calorie foods so that people could eat them in the cities. That was kind of the idea. That's how it all evolved. That's how it all emerged. Nowadays, we have refrigeration, and thanks to refrigeration, we can eat much closer to that whole food style diet without all of the preservatives, which is much healthier for you. So all of that, the problem is a lot of those chemicals have the preservatives and the chemicals that are used and the seed oils and the trans fats and all the stuff that's used to make things shelf stable are not good for you in a long term. A lot of them cause inflammation. The human body's not really designed to digest that kind of stuff. So at best case scenario, you just kind of pass that stuff through. It doesn't actually add nutrition. And on top of that, the processed foods are very, very calorie dense, but not very nutritionally dense. That's another problem. So you have tons of calories. So you take like an apple, for example, completely unprocessed. You just go out and you pluck it. It's got a certain amount of vitamins, minerals, and all that kind of stuff. But it's also got lots of fiber, and it's also got very little calories, really. An apple's like 100 calories, so it's got all this stuff built in. Now, you take that same apple, and you strip everything away from it, and you add a bunch of sugar, and you cook it. Now you've got apple sauce, so you've increased the calorie density. So now you went from an apple, which was very healthy because it had all this stuff as part of a package. It had fiber, it had a small amount of calories, it had vitamins, and it had minerals, and it has all this stuff together. Now you turn into applesauce, and now it's got tons of calories, and comparatively speaking, it compared to the amount of calories, it's got very little fiber now because it's all been cooked away or shucked, and now it's got very, very little vitamins and minerals compared to the amount of calories. And that's how you get from processed foods. That's why those processed foods are so bad. Take that to a micro scale. If all you eat are processed foods, then in the long term you're eating very high calorie foods with very low nutritional value, which I think is really the root of all of our health problems today in America, is focusing on those types of things. So when you're talking about processed foods, the bottom line, what are we talking about? We're talking about cakes, candies, crackers, sodas, anything that that you can't just go out into nature and get. Okay, so hot dogs are processed foods, as opposed to chicken nuggets are processed foods, as opposed to a chicken breast. A chicken breast isn't processed; it's just butchered, right? But then they do all kinds of stuff to chicken nuggets to make it. They add all kinds of chemicals. They add breading. They grind it up. They add all kinds of things. A lot of meats that they serve today, they use centrifuges to separate the meat from the fats so that they can measure it all and make specific amounts and everything, which I just don't think is very healthy for you. I think you've got to get that whole food. You've got to get complete food instead of trying to isolate the kind of stuff. You need to get it all together. You need to get it all holistically. Whole food is the best food for you, and the more you can avoid the processed foods, the better off you're going to be. All right, guys, you guys have a great Monday. Get the week started off great, and I hope you enjoyed this. Let me know what you think anytime in the comments. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and I will talk to you later.